Welcome to Secret Story. The warm night air gently caressed Sophie Harper's slender shoulders as she stood smiling at her reflection in the full-length mirror in her and Josh's bedroom. She was smiling because she had just finished getting ready to go out on her and Josh's joint bachelor/bachelorette party night, and she looked stunning. Sophie had finished herself off by tying her fringe back into a small ponytail, while the rest of her long, blonde hair hung straight down her slender back, revealing not only her beautiful, big, blue-eyed on her small feet. She wore a pair of red strappy shoes with a heel, and her 3-week-old, diamond engagement ring finished off the outfit. She knew that she looked stunning. And that was the very look that she had intended on. After all, this was her last night as a single girl. Tomorrow she would marry Josh. Josh and her had decided to have their parties together, and just invite everyone they knew together and just go and have a good night out, which had made it easier as they had only gotten engaged 3 weeks ago. And while it had been hectic to get everything sorted on time, they had managed it, only to realize that they hadn't planned a night out, and so they decided to just have one big one. And so, they had arranged to meet all of their family and friends at a club on the Strip, party all night, come home, then Josh would wake up early tomorrow and leave so that he didn't see Sophie in her dress. Sophie smiling at the sudden glinting of her 3-week-old engagement ring. She still felt her stomach flutter when she saw that diamond ring on her slim finger, and not only because she knew by looking at it that she was soon going to marry the guy that she loved. Her stomach fluttered mainly because 3 weeks ago, on the very night her loving fiancé had given it to her and proposed, the memories made her even hornier, added to the fact that she hadn't cheated on Josh in those entire 3 weeks. Oh, she had come close to it with Billy again, but they had never gotten the chance to. She had screwed Josh, and he was always amazing, but she needed more, and she needed it now. I'm definitely going to get laid tonight, she said to herself, and she knew it was true. That she would never be faithful again, only now, she was planning on getting a good tonight, who it didn't matter, as long as it was hot. Babe, you ready? The taxi's here, came the sweet sound of her loving fiancé, as he called up the stairs to her. Coming, babe, she called back. Josh Seymour stood looking up the stairs with a sly smile on his handsome face as he waited for Sophie to finish getting herself ready. He knew that she always took ages to get ready, and that's why he had booked the taxi to pick them up a little later than what he had told Sophie. He knew her so well. As he stood there waiting, shivers of excitement rippled through his stomach. He had been looking forward to this night ever since he had thought of proposing to his fiancée of 3 years, and now it was finally here. The day before, he was actually going to marry Sophie Harper, the sweetest woman he had ever known. That thought always filled him with an immense happiness which he knew could never be topped. That was until he saw Sophie walk through their bedroom door and head down the stairs. Josh smiled back playfully. Sophie loved flirting, and she had gotten more and more flirty over the last couple of months. But he didn't mind. After all, it was Sophie's flirting that had won him so much lately against Ben and his other coworkers. With the way you look, babe, every guy in town is going to be hard, he replied. Do you mind that every guy will be ogling me? She asked, her eyes gleaming playfully. Josh just smiled, as he felt warm inside. He really loved this girl. Let them all look. After all, I'm going to be marrying you tomorrow, and I want to show you off. All those guys can just see what they're missing, and I have forever, he answered, bringing a bigger smile to Sophie's gorgeous face. Yeah, Sophie agreed, a bright light twinkling in her eye. Did you say the taxi was here? Yeah, Josh replied, as he remembered about the cab outside. I'd completely forgotten about that with how you look. But the taxi's here, so we better go. But keep that thought, boy, she purred. Josh just smiled back at her as he let her move back. Let's get going then, he said, as he smiled and opened the door, smiling at the thought of how much fun this night was going to be, and how much more fun it would be when they got back tonight. Josh followed his fiancée of 3 years out of the front door, closing it behind him, and walked towards the taxi. The air was warm, but the night had only just began heating up. The taxi ride was pleasant, and didn't take as long as usual, as Sophie was staring out of the window in a pleasant daydream, a content smile on her pretty face. Sophie was thinking that, finally, tonight she would be able to get screwed by one of while Josh was busy. She hoped it was Tyler, but Billy would be just as good too. She even had it all planned out. Josh would be with his friends, drinking for a while, then she could dance with a few guys, play around a little, before sneaking off outside to have the life out of her, before coming back in to spend the rest of the night with her loving fiancé. Then she would go back home, Josh once more, go to sleep, and then wake up for her wedding day. Sophie couldn't help smiling inside and out at that plan. It was completely perfect. Nothing could go wrong, and that made the anticipation she felt, and the smile on her beautiful face, grow. The ride passed almost in an instant as Sophie sat dreamily anticipating the night's events. And before long the taxi had pulled up and Josh was paying the fare before he got out of the car. Sophie followed by opening her door, and slowly bending as she stood out of the car, just to make sure that the two bouncers at the door got a good look down her very low-cut dress. The two were big, muscular men, one black and one white, and both were dressed in tuxedo suits. As her eyes traveled over the big men, a wicked thought came into Sophie's mind of the two of them taking her later. Trying to keep the instant flutters in her stomach down, Sophie kept the two in mind for later as she and Josh made their way towards the two suited men at the door. Josh Seymour and Sophie Harper. Josh said, as he walked up in front of the white guy. Sophie smiled through her eyelashes playfully as the pair's eyes moved quickly from Josh to her. "Yeah, you two are here for the bachelor night, right?" The white guy asked in an Italian-American accent, as he looked reluctantly at Josh once more. The black guy's eyes remained on Sophie's face. "Yeah, me and my fiancé are getting married tomorrow, quite short notice, you know, so we're having a joint party," Josh replied to the white guy, who nodded half-heartedly. "You've got nothing on you that we'd have to search you for, do you?" The black man asked Josh, before glancing back at Sophie. "Of course not," Josh answered with a light laugh. "Yeah, thought so, but we've got to ask, you know," the black guy replied, with a smile at them both. Sophie could feel herself trembling. She hoped that she wasn't actually shaking. "Anyway, have a good night, guys. Hope to see you around," the white guy said, with a charming smile at her and Josh, before the black guy opened the door he was standing in front of. "Thanks guys, you too," Josh replied, as he walked through the door first, still holding Sophie's hand as she followed behind him. Sophie was glad when she walked through the door. Sophie felt her heart beat faster just as the thought came into her mind. She turned around and Josh was standing looking at her. "What's up?" he asked confusedly. "Oh, nothing," she said, with a quick glance back. The two were still glancing back to look at her. "I just thought I heard someone call my name." Josh just smiled back, before they headed into the main room of the club. The Hot Rod Club was one of Shorehaven's best clubs, and had a very high-profile guest list at times. It wasn't the most famed and hottest club in the city, but it was still huge and very, very popular. It had 5 separate rooms, each with different styles of music in, as well as the main room, and the VIP room. The VIP room was obviously closed to most people, all except the elite, famous, and rich of the city, so Sophie and Josh had arranged to meet everyone in the vast main room. The main room was absolutely humongous. It had 3 bars, one on each respective wall except the main entrance. There was a large dance area in the middle, which must have been easily 200 square feet on its own. Tables, chairs, and leather sofas covered the surrounding walls, while 2 staircases led to the 2 glass upper rooms, and a door to the left and right led to the other 2 rooms. The 5th room was in the basement and was accessible from one of the doors opposite the entrance, while the VIP room was the door on the other side of the bar, with another 2 big bouncers in front of it. The entire place was filled with life and music, and lasers and lights danced through the air. As dry ice shot out to form a thin mist in the air making bars of light shine. People were everywhere, and the music was so loud that Josh had to shout for Sophie to hear him. The place was perfect for Sophie to get lost in long enough to have hot with Tyler, Billy, or maybe those bouncers at the door. "They're over here," Josh shouted, so that Sophie could hear, as he walked towards one corner of the room. And sure enough, after a minute or two, Sophie could finally make out the mass of people that had come to celebrate her and Josh's marriage. Tyler was there, with Richie, Paul, Steve, Ben, and more of Josh's workmates. Charles Riley was there, with his family and other business associates. Her and Josh's friends were all there, milling about and drinking as they smiled and hugged them. Sophie then caught sight of her family, her mom, dad, sister, and brother, and then Josh's family, his mom, dad, his older brother and his wife, his older sister and her husband, and, of course, Billy. Sophie's heart almost beat out of her chest as she saw so many of the guys she was behind Josh's back all in one room. As Sophie looked at them all the guests for her and Josh's wedding tomorrow, the men stared back, eyes filled with lust, the women staring either with jealousy or admiration. The night passed on after Sophie and Josh greeted their friends and family. After the initial welcoming hugs and greetings, especially enjoyed by the men, the night quickly turned to drinking and fun. Josh had gone for the first round for him and Sophie and was back sitting down talking to everyone with his fiancée, passing the time with jokes, stories, and drinking. Everybody seemed to be having a good time, when Sophie kissed Josh on the cheek and told him she was going to dance. He watched happily as Sophie swayed away towards the large, crowded dance floor in that short, unknowing of what was going to happen that night. Sophie slowly swayed onto the dance floor, making sure that her hips moved to the rhythm of the music as she moved. She loved dancing, but she loved it even more when every male eye that touched on her followed her as she moved to the far side of the floor from her family and friends. She didn't want to be seen by anyone she knew right now, and judging by how crowded the club was, Sophie thought it shouldn't be too hard to hide. She could feel the heat rising in her body as images of all of the guys flickered through her mind. Tyler, Riley, Billy, the bouncers at the door. Then suddenly, as Sophie's hands reached up under her hair, another pair. The kiss was passionate, but didn't last very long, but this time, when the guy broke the kiss, Sophie opened her eyes. She didn't know either of them. "I guess you didn't mind," the guy who was standing in front of her said, "and you looked like you needed a little company." Sophie smiled teasingly back at the guy. "Not at all. It was fun," she replied. "Good, maybe you'd like a bit more fun." The same guy said, "We have an RV outside, maybe we could show you some of our specialty moves," the one who had been behind her said. Sophie's heart beat faster. Here she was on her and Josh's last night out before their wedding, and two random guys had just kissed her, on the dance floor, and now wanted her to go to their RV outside. Smiling playfully again at the two, and trying not to look desperately horny, Sophie said, "Sorry, boys, but I'm engaged, and my fiancé's over the other side of the room. We're getting married tomorrow, see," and she lifted her hand up to show them her 3-week-old diamond engagement ring. The pair just smiled as they looked at her. They were both very attractive guys. "Well, you seem to enjoy our moves just, and your fiancé should be here taking care of you now," the one who had been behind her said. "And, besides, we would love to give you a present for your wedding," the one from the front said. "What do you say?" Sophie's stomach turned flips and her heart continued to pound in her chest. She needed this so badly. Sophie's smile broadened on her beautiful, blue-eyed face, and she was just about to agree, when she saw Billy making his way through the crowd towards her. "Sorry, boys, that's my brother-in-law-to-be who's coming," she said, as she gestured towards Billy. Billy reached the three of them just as Sophie gestured at him, and the other two glanced from him back to Sophie. "Well, come find us if you change your mind," the guy from in front said with a smile. "Maybe later then, guys," she replied with a playful look, before they walked away and left her alone with Josh's younger brother. "What did those guys want?" Billy asked as he watched them walk away. Sophie couldn't help but smile, as she looked up at Billy's handsome face. "They just wanted to dance, Billy Bull. Why, are you jealous?" she cooed playfully, as she moved closer to him. "I'm just looking out for my future sister-in-law," he said with that same charming smile that had set her heart beating 3 weeks ago. If I remember correctly, you looked after me really well last time we were alone," Sophie said, "and if I'm correct, you haven't had a good inspection since then," Billy said, "and it's important to have regular inspections to keep things working to their best ability." Sophie said, "and you're just the mechanic to inspect me. Who else would know what's good for Josh than his own flesh and blood?" Looks like you've got the perfect tool for the job, and I know that you know how to use it," Sophie said. "Then how about I take you outside and give you that inspection?" "What, the night before my wedding, you want to thoroughly inspect your brother's bride, Billy Bull?" Sophie back, "Let's go Soph. I did 3 weeks ago. I've waited too long for this again," he growled, before taking a hold of her hand and almost pulling her across the dance floor. She loved seeing Billy being dominant. That thought made her legs go weak again. Here was her fiancé's brother, almost dragging her by the hand towards the entrance so that he could take her outside. She was going to love this. Just then, however, Sophie felt another hand firmly grip her left hand, as it trailed behind her, as she walked quickly, and suddenly she came to a halt. The inside her cried out that she had to go outside, but when she turned around, there, holding her hand tightly, was Tyler. Billy came to stand by Sophie. Her hand still in his, lust and impatience painted across his face. "You can't hog her all night, man, other people want to dance with the bride-to-be too, you know," Tyler said, looking as arrogant as he always did. Billy looked ready to yell back, but Tyler hadn't finished. "Oh, and Josh wants to speak to you." Okay, that was most definitely not a question to Sophie's ears. Billy looked a little while at Tyler before turning to whisper into her ear. "Don't go too far, Sophie, I'm still going to nail you tonight," he said with Sophie felt the familiar electricity run through her as Billy spoke to her. But with one more look of defiance at Tyler, Billy walked away towards the side of the room Josh and everyone else was. And Sophie was left in Tyler's very big, very strong, and very capable hands. "It's been too long, Sophie," Tyler said as he smiled down at her. "Too long, Tyler, and you were the one who wouldn't take me when I wanted you, so what makes you think I would want you now?" she asked. "This is why, girl," Tyler answered. Sophie felt her knees melt, and if it wasn't for Tyler's strong hands holding tightly to her waist, she would have been down on her knees in front of him right then. "Hey, Soph, I love the dress." Tyler's eyes had taken on the look of Sophie's own. "You want to right here, Tyler?" Sophie said, "Maybe I want to get drunk," she said with a teasing smile, and the lust within her grew even more. "And why would you want that?" said the guy who had stood in front of her on the dance floor. "Because it's my last night as a single girl," she said teasingly, and downed the contents of the glass before placing it behind her on the bar. The two exchanged smiles with each other, and then they both moved to stand either side of her, leaning against the bar. "Well, if you get too drunk, then you might not know who you go home with tonight. Or what might happen with them," the first guy said. "Well, it's a good job I have you two boys here to protect me then," she responded playfully. They both smiled and laughed with her, before moving a little closer to her, almost pressing against her from both sides. Sophie's breathing grew slightly heavier. "Say," the first guy began, "the drinks are overpriced in here and we've got some bottles in the RV, and seeing as it's the night before your wedding, we thought you might like to have a special celebration. Have you guys got anything to entertain a girl like me in your truck?" Sophie asked. She was going to these two complete strangers, in their RV, in the parking lot outside the club, while her fiancé, and all their family and friends, celebrated the wedding day tomorrow. "I'm sure we've got a couple of things to keep you going for a while, gorgeous," the second guy said with a smile. "Then don't keep a girl waiting," she said teasingly. As she reluctantly removed both of their hands and pushed herself away from the bar. The two guys smiled and were just about to lead her outside when Sophie felt someone tap her on the shoulder. Irritation flared up inside her at whoever was getting in the way, but when she turned around that quickly faded as the face of Josh's older brother Simon came into view. "Hey, Soph, I've been looking for you," Simon began seriously, it's Josh. It was replaced by worry over the man she loved. Why, what's wrong? She said, the guys behind her instantly forgotten. Nothing bad, Simon answered reassuringly, he's okay, it's just that Dad bought him a really strong mix of drinks and now he can't sit. Let alone stand. Dad's going to take him home, and Josh won't go anywhere without you. Dad tried to tell him to leave you here to have fun, but he won't leave without you. Fine, let's go find him. Sophie said, as she walked past Simon and headed toward the tables fast. Once she got there, Josh was being supported by his father and it was obvious that he would have been on his back if he tried to stand alone. Baby! Josh yelled as soon as he saw her, and tried to move to hug her, but David, his father, wouldn't let him go. You're in no state to stand on your own, Josh, David said, as Josh looked at him wondering why he held him back. Come on, babe, Sophie said, as she put Josh's other arm around her shoulders to help David support him. I'm here now, let's get you back. Ah, I love you, Sophie. You're so special, Josh slurred affectionately, as she and his dad helped him to walk out of the club. I love you too, Sophie replied half-heartedly, as her mind was elsewhere. And now any chance of that had ended as she walked Josh out of the club to go home. She hadn't cheated on him for 3 weeks. David Seymour held his son up with ease as he helped Sophie walk Josh towards the car. This evening was going better than he could ever have imagined when he had come up with the plan to get his son drunk. As they placed Josh down into the back seat of the car, David smiled at the gorgeous, blonde fiancée, and held her door open so she could get in the front of the car. Thanks, Sophie said with a smile, as she lowered herself into the car. Thank you, David thought in reply, as he watched her climb in. Soon they were heading back towards Josh and Sophie's house. Josh soon fell fast asleep in the back, and Sophie seemed lost in her own world as she sat and stared out of the window as they drove. David didn't mind the silence too much, it gave him the perfect opportunity to keep stealing glances at his son's bride-to-be. Of course, he had to play things slowly and cool, so that no one would suspect what he was doing. That's why he hadn't spent much time around the knockout fiancée that night. But now he had the perfect opportunity to be completely alone with this girl. And no one would think anything strange about it. David couldn't help but smile as they pulled into the driveway. He had a whole load to empty tonight. Sophie once again helped David prop Josh up and walked him towards the house. Josh was all but out for the count now, as his head drooped forward, and he barely managed to not get dragged along. Finally, however, Sophie and David dropped Josh onto the sofa opposite the TV. The frustration burned into irritation as she looked at Josh. He's out for it tonight, David said calmly, but with a small smile. Yeah, thanks to you, Sophie said, as she turned to face Josh's dad. Her irritation had to be let loose on someone. And David had gotten Josh drunk, and so it was as much his fault as his son's. Hey, it is my son's last night before he gets married, Sophie, I am allowed to celebrate with him, David responded adamantly. She tried to calm herself down. After all, he did have the right to celebrate with his son. I'm sorry, David, I'm just a bit irritated, that's all, Sophie said, as she turned to give Josh one more look. It wasn't his fault, even though she felt it was. How about a coffee since we're back? Sure, he replied, I'll make you one seeing as you're getting married. My chance to congratulate you. Sophie couldn't help but smile a small smile as David walked past her and headed through the glass doors and into the kitchen. She stood and looked at Josh, looking all cute as he sat asleep on the sofa, his head lolling forward and his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. As she walked through the doors, David turned and smiled at her, as he placed a cup of coffee on the counter for her. I've got to say, Sophie, you look really gorgeous tonight, he said casually. Sophie couldn't help but be taken aback by the comment. That was one thing she hadn't expected Josh's father to say when she walked through into the room. Thanks, she managed to say in a surprised tone, you look handsome yourself. She had said it as just a response, a polite response for his compliment, but it was at that moment that Sophie really did notice just how handsome Josh's dad was. He was 53 years old, with his hair gelled back like Billy had his, although he was slightly taller than both Billy and Josh, about 6 feet 1 inch, Sophie guessed. He had the same build as Billy, and although he was older, he was not only handsome, he was physically in good shape, by the look of him. It was obvious where Billy and Josh got their good looks from, and David Seymour just looked like an older version of Josh's younger brother. Looking at David, so familiar to his two sons, brought questions into Sophie's mind. Was he as good as his sons at? All of these thoughts flooded through her mind. Are you okay, Sophie? You look a little flustered. David said, sounding amused. Sophie smiled back at him sweetly. Yeah, I'm fine, she began. So, you think this dress isn't too much? She asked, as she looked down at herself, trying to hide her smile. She loved flirting, and she was incredibly horny now. I don't think a dress like that could ever be too much on a girl like you, Sophie, David answered playfully, before taking a sip of his own coffee. A girl like me? Sophie asked with a smile. Well, you're beautiful, and you know it. And if you've got the gifts that you have naturally, you should always show them off to their best, David replied calmly and sweetly. She smiled back at him over the rim of the cup. Flirting always made her hornier. Still looking at him in the eyes with her own filled eyes. Sophie drank the rest of her coffee before setting it back down on the counter. How could she have not noticed how Josh's dad was before now? You make a nice coffee, David, Sophie said with a playful smile up at him. Thanks, he replied with a returned smile. You drink fast. I like to swallow it all while it's still hot. I don't want to miss any. I like the taste too much, she replied. That's good to know, Josh's dad replied with a sparkle in his eyes. I like a girl who doesn't waste things. Want another? David asked as he looked at her, his gaze turning her on even more. What, are you trying to keep me up all night? She replied teasingly. I wouldn't need coffee for that. He answered coolly, before taking another drink of his coffee. Sophie felt her stomach leap inside her. She couldn't control herself much longer. Maybe you can tell me why in a minute. I'm just going to check on Josh first, she said with as teasing a smile as she could. I want to make sure he's comfortable. And with a playful smile, she slowly turned towards the glass doors. After looking at David as a very handsome man, rather than just Josh's father, she had finally come up with a way. It was the night before her wedding day, and while her fiancé was out cold on the sofa, Sophie couldn't help but smile in anticipation as she walked into the lounge. And that thought put a large smile onto her beautiful face. Josh's father watched intently as the stunning. He couldn't believe how well this was going, far better in fact than he had thought. Finishing his coffee, he smiled, and placed it down on the counter beside Sophie's cup. He straightened his shirt and tie before slightly adjusting his pants. Sophie stood smiling as she looked down at Josh as he slept. The first reason she was smiling was because she always did when she looked at her handsome and loving fiancé. The second reason was that she knew that finally, after 3 long weeks, she was finally going to get. Gently she bent down and kissed Josh on the forehead, but as she straightened up, she felt a presence behind her. She knew it could only be one person. But what did surprise her was that David had come into the lounge rather than waiting in the kitchen for her. Her heart began to beat faster as she thought about what she was going to do tonight. She had cheated on Josh now numerous times, with his younger brother the very night they had gotten engaged, his boss while she was on the phone to him, and quite a few of his friends and coworkers too. But this was his dad, and this was the night before their wedding. Keeping a sweet smile on her face, Sophie slowly turned around to look up into Josh's father's handsome face. He's sound asleep, she said sweetly, as she smiled and looked up into his eyes. So, he's not going to be able to give you the attention you deserve then, he replied with a smile. I guess not. Sophie answered, tell me something, David, why did you really buy Josh so many drinks? Josh's father smiled playfully. I told you, to celebrate with him, he began, and after I'd celebrated with him, I wanted to celebrate with you. Celebrate with me? And how do you plan on doing that? She said playfully. Now, that's no way to treat your son's fiancée, Sophie teased with a smile. Let me see what my son's going to marry, he said, and Sophie smiled. She wondered whether this was a family trait, as Billy had wanted to do the same thing. Well, am I good enough for your son? She asked playfully. Now let's get this party started. And how exactly are we going to celebrate? She asked teasingly. Well, Josh has had his bachelor party from me, so you need a bachelorette party from me, he began. Sophie trembled inside at the obvious insinuation. David smiled at her teasing. One more bang, was all he said. Sophie smiled, and tried to remain calm looking. Well, I think you better show me what you mean instead, because I still don't understand, she said innocently. She started to move forward and was surprised when David pulled her back. And where do you think you're going? David asked playfully. I was taking you up to the bedroom, Sophie said, sounding slightly irritated. He was delaying her satisfaction. What for? David asked teasingly now. Sophie took a deep breath. Well, I think we should celebrate right here, he replied. Let me see, you want to, your son's fiancée, down here when your son, my fiancé, is sitting asleep less than 4 feet away? And knowing that our wedding day is tomorrow? She asked, teasingly innocent. All he could do was nod, confirming, then I think it's about time we stop talking and get on with the celebrations, she said. But, as her hands were slowly sliding down, David's grabbed hold of her hands and pulled her back up. Sophie couldn't help but look at him. Don't you want? She asked without even trying to sound calm. He still smiled at her as he held her wrists. We have plenty of time tonight, Sophie, after all. I don't think Josh will be awake anytime soon. Here she was, a 22-year-old, blonde girl, passionately kissing a 53-year-old man, while her fiancé, his son, sat asleep right next to them on the sofa. She breathed heavier, knowing and waiting in anticipation for what was about to happen. David started to quickly. It was time to fulfill his dream. Come here, and help me celebrate my bachelorette party. Josh sat, lost in a dreamless sleep. All that filled his head was a vague noise every now and then. The sound of someone. The world didn't seem to exist anymore, but those sounds, and they grew louder and louder as he continued to sleep. There were definitely going to be a lot more times like this. He thought to himself as he stared at the gorgeous face of his son's bride. Just as he thought, she reacted to him mentioning Josh. That's when he came up with an idea that almost made him lose control. We've been having all of the fun, so I think it's only fair if Josh has some fun too, he began, and the anger and frustration disappeared as confusion took Sophie's eyes over. He is the groom after all, and you're the bride. This better be good, Sophie angrily. Bend over and give your fiancé a quick kiss, Sophie, he said as lust burst inside him. Sophie just smiled wickedly and turned to bend down slowly and kiss Josh lightly on the lips. Hope you're having a nice dream. Baby, she said sweetly to him. Sophie knew this was going to be a big one, and so looking into Josh's sleeping face, she smiled. I'm going to give you your wedding present soon, Sophie, I hope you like it, he said. This was it, and then it happened. Well, you certainly made an impression on the bride-to-be, she said. David looked up and smiled weakly at her. Sophie just returned his smile. I know, she said proudly, you look tired. David nodded slightly before speaking. How long have we been sitting here, he said, looking around in a half-daze. I don't know, she answered. How long had they been there? But I hope you're not too tired and weak, she said, as she stood up. David replied. Before smiling, does my son know what a ballbuster he's marrying? Sophie smiled as she reached for his hand and watched him stand up. Not even half of it, she replied with a secretive smile. David smiled back as he stood proudly in front of her. I think I need a shower. Sophie began her own. I can't be all sweaty for my wedding day, can I? I'd love to help, David replied, sounding noble. They walked through into her and Josh's room, leaving all of David's clothes strewn on the floor in the lounge. If Josh woke up he would have known what was happening, but Sophie knew how well he slept when drunk. Ben had proven that fact. Slowly they entered the ensuite of her and Josh's room. The door stood wide open. Just the way Sophie loved it, risky. And she smiled at David as he stood watching her. Clothes lay strewn across the floor, his father's and Sophie's, but Josh just continued to sleep. If only he woke up, he would see the clothes all around in front of him. But with how much his father had given him to drink, Josh Seymour was out for the count, dreaming of marrying his girl, Sophie Harper. Tomorrow she could just imagine how it looked now. David's breathing was heavy, and he looked totally drained. "Oh, look what you've done to my engagement ring," she said. "Now that's better," she said, as she looked at the shining diamond ring. "You're so good at everything, Sophie," David began tiredly. "I look forward to doing this again." She just smiled at him playfully and replied, "Me too." As she and David began to clean themselves up, Sophie couldn't help but feel completely happy and satisfied. She was getting married tomorrow, and she had just gotten laid tonight. Josh continued to dream happily of how tomorrow would go. His dreams of his beautiful bride walking down the aisle all dressed in white, marrying him, being his forever, and of how happy he was with her. Sophie stepped out of the shower and began drying herself. She smiled back at him. "Me, and the fact that I'm your son's fiancée," she said. "Yeah," David replied, and laughed lightly before his face suddenly changed. "What time is it?" "I don't know, late though," she replied. "Ah, I forgot I said I was only going to drop you guys off and then head back," he replied, as he walked out of the ensuite. Sophie dropped the towel she was using to dry her hair with on the floor and followed him through into her and Josh's bedroom. "Just tell them Josh was being a handful, it's not lying, he was heavy to carry," she began, "and say I needed your help with something." She smiled at David as he turned from the door to smile back. "True," he said, "I'll think of something on the way back." He turned towards the door after smiling at her. "They'll be wondering where I am anyway," he replied as he began to shake his head. "Maybe." Sophie smiled playfully. "They can wait," he said. "An hour or so passed. "Well, I had to celebrate your engagement to my son properly," David replied, as she began to move to sit up. She felt weak herself. She had been so thoroughly, and she had been needing this for 3 weeks now, and finally she was satisfied. There was one thing for sure, she would sleep well tonight. "Don't forget you have to come around early to pick Josh up," she said as she stood up, hoping her legs were strong enough to hold her. "He can't see me before the wedding." David turned to her and smiled playfully, as they both moved towards the door. "If he's still asleep maybe I'll give you something special," he said playfully. She responded happily, "Now there's a thought." They made their way down to the lounge again. "Have a good night," she said with a smile. "You too," David replied, she said playfully, before moving back into the hallway and holding the door. "I loved celebrating with you tonight." David smiled lustfully. "So did I." They smiled and said goodnight again, and then he left, and Sophie gently closed the door behind him, her face beaming with a content and satisfied smile. Then she headed into the lounge again, and gently kissed Josh on the lips hard. "Good night, baby, I love you so much, and I can't wait to marry you tomorrow," she said as she looked at him sleeping. Once more she kissed him, before heading back upstairs and climbing into bed. As she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but feel happier than she had ever felt in her whole life. This was it, she was really going to get married tomorrow to the man of her dreams. Josh wouldn't be there when she woke up. It was bad luck to see the bride before the wedding smiling happily. She snuggled into her pillow and slowly let herself fall asleep, the hopes and expectations of tomorrow drifting through her mind. She was finally going to marry the man she loved, Josh. It was going to be the most special day of her life. If only she knew how special it was going to be. She drifted into a happy, dream-filled sleep, and slept soundly and happily all night long. To be continued.